hire people who are going to love doing this work. Find the people who will do well here because that's who they are, not because they've got to go through Herculean efforts to change their behaviors in order to fit in. Hey, Brian.
Hey, welcome Vishal, and welcome everybody to this episode of the Budburst Podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, we find exceptional go-to-market executives that have spent their careers in technology. We ask them to join the show and share their story, share where they came from, how they grew up, some influential folks and moments in their life, and just their career arc overall, highlighting some key learnings along the way that hopefully folks can kind of take with them as they go forward in their career. So Vishal, glad you're here, man. I'd love to have you introduce yourself to our audience here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I'm Vishal Rana. I'm currently a partner at Deciens Capital, which is an early stage venture capital organization. I started out in a very different world. I started out in the East Coast, grew up in New Jersey, went to school in New York, and then went into sort of traditional finance and insurance. Working in a big office building, and joined the military along the way, spent some time in the reserves, learned a lot about building teams, and then continued on at some point, kind of got over being in a big city and decided to move out west. Followed my now wife out to California, went back to school, got my MBA at Berkeley, and then joined the technology scene. And from that, helped a couple of companies get to really significant exits, an IPO and an acquisition. I've been part of 3 awesome technology organizations, and really just got the bug for building teams and building companies. And now super excited to be part of an incredible fintech-focused venture capital firm where I get to help build companies and teams across a whole portfolio instead of just one. And so kind of a dream job for me. And it's been an awesome journey to get here. Lots of different things I've picked up along the way, and excited to chat about them.
Yeah, man, I want to dive into all of that. I think your just whole life journey is fascinating. And I'm sure there's a bunch of folks out there listening who are veterans or maybe still serving and that are going to want to hear how you made some of those jumps too. Before we do that though, let's talk a little bit about Deciens. I know you mentioned kind of a dream job for you. I've felt that in my career. I know lots of folks have. Like, how did they set themselves up to be able to do what you're doing now? Are you loving it as much as you kind of hoped you would?
Yeah, I mean, it's some of the most challenging and fulfilling work I've done in my career. A big part of what makes Deciens special, and I think really distinct from other venture capital firms, is how involved we become with our portfolio companies. Part of our strategy is to make far fewer investments than the typical VC. We have on average between 10 and 15 investments per fund. Most early stage VCs will have between 30 and 50. But what that means is we get to spend significantly more time with each one. We also invest significantly more capital into them, and so we've got more at stake. But that particular style of VC is really appealing to me as a former operator who really, I don't want to just write a check and get board meeting updates once a quarter. I want to be in the guts of it, working with the CEOs, working with the founding teams, actually helping build and co-build those companies. For me, the larger VCs didn't feel like they would be as fulfilling, right? There's no way I could span myself across multiple funds with 40, 50 companies per fund. I mean, I'd be doing an hour phone call once in a while with an individual company and never really get to dive in to the business dynamics that any individual portfolio company was really part of. And so that just wouldn't have been as intellectually challenging. It would have kind of just been like, well, when I was at Segment, I did this. And when I was at Medallia, I did that. And that would be kind of the depth I could get to. I really love sinking my teeth deeper into it and learning about the industries our organizations are part of.
Yeah, I was going to ask why Deciens, but I think you just answered it. It sounds like the model appeals uniquely well to you. I mean, I would agree from the outside. That sounds really attractive, right? Fewer clients at any given time, more depth, and potentially more impact.
Yeah, and Deciens, is a fintech focused organization. So we invest primarily in companies that have some connection to financial services. Now, those connections range wildly. Like in some cases, it's music finance. In other cases, it's energy and clean tech and embedded finance into that. Sometimes it's insurance. Sometimes it's up the middle, payments and banking. But this was the stuff that I used to do when I worked in a large company and sort of saw how very large financial institutions didn't meet the needs of individuals, and then kind of went to Medallia and led the financial services practice. And I will get to that, but like that story kind of flows through where I sort of then went to try and help the very large companies figure out how to better serve their customers. And part of that story was really reimagining how the products at those large institutions would be built. And a lot of times the biggest organizations weren't able to kind of reimagine their products. And so joining Deciens, kind of where I am now, I'm helping to build the companies that built the products that I wished these very large companies would be able to create. And so it's kind of a full circle, having been inside of it, tried to help the large companies do it, and then say, okay, we're going to build the challengers, and they will reshape financial services for the better.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. We do these interviews and you hear folks, end up in a great position like you are now at a great company that fits, and it all feels very linear with the benefit of hindsight, right? You were in finance and you had these other jobs, and they all sort of now logically make sense that you ended up doing what you're doing. I know it doesn't feel like that along the way, so we'll talk a little bit about those, like some of those key pivots that you made, some intentional, some a little bit lucky, like you mentioned, following your now wife out to California. But man, on the same front with Deciens, are the challenges you thought you would face similar? Like, you've been doing it now a little while. Is the job roughly what you expected? I'm sure there's folks out there thinking, yeah, okay, but like, what does that actually entail? Like, what are the hard parts? Is it what I expect it is, or is it different? Yeah. So maybe a little bit of a day in the life or a week in the life would be great too.
Yeah, I think thinking about like what I expected coming in or what I was worried about versus what came to be, I think what I was most worried about was that founders and early teams wouldn't be interested in engaging more deeply. When I was an executive at a handful of companies that were backed by great VCs and had great board members, but when I, as an exec, needed help, I wasn't the CEO. And so I didn't have a board member at my beck and call. And if I asked the portfolio company like team, what's called in the business portfolio support or platform, I'd get routed to some other executive who was kind of in a similar role as me in another company. And that was helpful, but that was like sort of like the 1 hour phone call of like, hey, here's what we did here. Like, let me know if you have questions. But it wasn't, hey, come learn a bunch of stuff about my problem and like co-solve it with me. And what my hypothesis coming in was that most companies didn't want that deeper consultative co-building engagement. And I was worried, and part of what my journey to Deciens was spending half of my time kind of as a operating partner, sort of a executive in residence, trying it out to make sure, honestly, that like I could do something meaningful here. What I didn't want to do was kind of be like quasi-retired, be the guy on the bat phone, or like, hey, call this guy if you need help. Otherwise, he's hanging around mowing his lawn. That's not what I wanted. I actually wanted to be in the guts of this stuff, and it turned out to be true that these companies were particularly excited. And I think this is really a function of Deciens and the types of founders we look for, which in many ways are not too dissimilar than the types of people we looked for at Medallia, who were people who wanted to learn from other people, no matter how smart they actually were themselves already and how accomplished they already were. They were voraciously hungry to learn from everybody they could find. And that's the type of founders we look for. And turns out those folks want to come and spend time with other people who've done things and take advice and are willing to share what they're working on, in a really different and meaningful way than what I experienced when I was working with other VCs. And so that was pleasant. That like played out, right? And that's after I saw that play out a couple times was when we made the move to have me join full time. I think if I think about day in the life of, just really quickly, sort of in venture capital, there are really like 3 or 4 primary functions, and the 3 kind of outward facing functions are finding companies and investing, raising money, and working with the portfolio companies. Those are kind of the outward facing functions. There's a fourth function, which is really the administration and building of the company that is the fund. And the role I have sits very squarely in the vast majority of my time is spent with portfolio companies, helping them build, sharing the sort of things that I figured out and messed up to help them avoid in my time. And so that's the sort of portfolio support component. Undervalued, I think, at most venture capital firms, and really an important part of the strategy at Deciens. The second kind of major area I'd say I spend a lot of time on is the building of the company and the organization. VC firms are in many ways just they're partnerships where you've got a handful of people who are all specialists in their own field and don't really come together to talk or discuss strategy or codify what makes them different or better. So I spend a lot of time kind of building what our ethos is and how and why we do the things we do, versus just, we're the collection of, these 2 or 3 people who've just operated in a particular way to turn ourselves into a cohesive unit. So the company building component. And the third thing I spend a good amount of time on is helping with fundraising. In many ways, we talk about, venture capital fundraising is a little bit like an enterprise sales motion, right? You can kind of treat it that way. We build a CRM, we think about leads, we think about where people are in a funnel and all that sort of stuff. That's not the way people naturally think about fundraising. But that methodology really works for us, and it's been good to be able to bring across some of this cross-disciplinary capability into the organization, so we can keep track of what we're doing. I do spend some time doing investing work, but I'd say it's probably the lowest concentration of my time. Mostly if it's in insurance or in energy or climate or things like that, things that I've spent some time working on in the past. Or data analytics and things from segment time, that's when I'll get pulled in. But if it's pure kind of banking regulatory stuff where the other guys have more expertise, they take those without a ton of input from me.
It's really helpful, man, and fascinating to me, and hopefully to a bunch of our listeners too. So I want to pull on one of the themes. So you just mentioned one of the kind of big buckets for you is like the company building, right? The team building. I know that's something that I've seen you do. I know that's been a big piece of your career, and just one of the themes that we'll hit on multiple times today. This idea of developing talent, building communities, but at work, right? Those words I feel probably get thrown around maybe too much. This idea of work and community and family. I've seen you do it many, many times now. 3 different companies have seen you do that really well, and so it's fascinating to me to hear that you're still doing it. Right, you found something that you're awesome at, and it's a piece of the job even in your VC life. So yeah, really cool, man. Thank you for sharing that glimpse in. We'll get back to that potentially at the end too, if time allows. But maybe we go back in time. Yeah. I know both your parents immigrated here when they were in their 20s. You grew up kind of just outside New York and New Jersey. Why don't you pick up from there and just kind of give us that look at your life? You ended up at NYU. How did that come to pass?
Yeah. And it's funny. I didn't quite know what I wanted to do when I was in high school growing up. We were a middle class family, probably straight down the middle. My parents were both they both worked for all of my childhood. My mother worked part-time to make sure she was home and could kind of do the sort of traditional housewife type responsibilities, which she was excited to do, and hang out with the kids and keep the house. My dad worked super long hours and commuted to New York City. He'd leave almost every day before I woke up in the morning, and he came home after I went to bed. I'd probably catch him for an hour at either end, depending on the day. But I didn't see him a ton during the week, and we spent a good amount of time on the weekends. But definitely something that when I thought about what my future was going to be, was in the back of my head was, hey, how do I make sure I spend more time with my family, and make sure that whatever I end up doing gives me that flexibility. And, that's not everyone's priority, but it was certainly one of my priorities. And I know one that Brian, you and I have talked about a lot, and, how we think about the different types of roles. I mean, I started out working in, I went to school in New York, and, part of that was staying close to family, because I was very close to my family, and a big part, our family unit was really tight. my cousins and everyone all lived in the same town. We were all within 10, 15 minutes of each other. And so kind of getting outside of that nucleus, even to go to New York, was kind of a big deal. I'd gotten into other schools in other parts of the country, and ended up not going to them and going to NYU, partially because it was a 5-minute walk from my dad's office. And that was really critical. One act of rebellion during that period, though, was I did just sort of enlist in the reserves, somewhat at like my parents' disapproval. I really felt like it was an important thing for me to do. It was something I really wanted to do. And when I turned 18, I drove down to the recruiter's office and enlisted. I don't think my parents quite actually believed me when I told them I did it. And like I was going through all the motions and going through the tests and all that stuff, and they were like, he's just checking it out. He's not actually going to do it. And I did it. And I think that's when it kind of hit him.
Can you speak a little bit? I mean, we've talked about this before, but I think it's fascinating because it's, again, a piece of who you are, but the sense of community and like your rationale for wanting to do that. I'm sure there's a little bit of rebellion in there, but I know there's more to it. So can you just shed a little bit of light on that too? Like your what was the catalyst for that decision for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked this question a bunch of times, and I think I joke that it was I must have watched too much G.I. Joe as a kid or something like that. And, I think to a large extent, some of that is true, right? Like, I think that I bought the camaraderie, the loyalty, the honor, the respect, the discipline, all of those things that when we think about the positive virtues of the military, I wanted all of those things. I think the other piece that was really important was I also saw that, my parents came to the United States. They both had college degrees in different fields, but, we kind of went from a not so well off life in India, which I observed as a kid when I went back to visit family, to a pretty good life in the United States. And I had a pretty awesome childhood growing up in a upper middle class suburb, right? Like, I never wanted to take that for granted. And part of my decision to join the military was a sense of giving back, right? So this country and this place and whatever, ideas and all of that stuff's changed and gone up or down or whatever, however you want to think about it. But, it is true that people can come here and start a life and build a family and have a radically better life here than they could where they came from. And that doesn't come for free. Everybody has to contribute back to it. And this was my way of contributing back. And at the time it was really my way of paying back that debt that I think we all owe to the luck of being born here, or I was born here, my parents moved here.
Yeah, I think that's so admirable, man. Like, I think the eyes wide open approach of, hey, I want these things, these values that the military stands for, and that I know you've taken from there and applied in your career, and then the sense of duty. I think it's amazing. So again, hopefully folks that are hearing this, that it resonates as deeply with them. I got to ask, like, knowing quite a bit of my network and friends are either active duty or were in the military. That we've got a bunch of friends in common. Man, you're like your NYU life and friend and circle, and then finance circle later, and then the military. Like, you're living in two pretty different circles that maybe otherwise wouldn't. Like, you might have been the only point of overlap in that Venn diagram. What was that like? Just kind of like living those two lives simultaneously.
It was wild, right? I mean, I was working in large office towers, not too different than the ones behind me, like at Bear Stearns when Bear Stearns was in its heyday, in an office overlooking Central Park. And then, that Friday afternoon, I'd go back home, hop in my car, put on my BDUs and drive down McGuire. And those were two universes that didn't really interact, even though the vast majority of people I was going to meet down at McGuire in Southern Jersey worked in New York City as firemen, policemen, postal service workers, and other sort of roles. It taught me an appreciation, and like this, it's going to sound cheesy, but like it really was these two really different worlds where financial services really helped one and was kind of a hindrance or just absent or void in the other. And so, if you were somebody of means who knew how to use financial institutions to your advantage, like they were a supercharger for your life. And I had an interest in economics and finance early. Like my dad, when I was 16, opened up like an E-Trade account for me, or I think it was Scott Trade at the time, whatever precursor organization it was. And he gave me $100 to go buy a couple shares, and I kind of got the bug and went from there, right? And so I had a conversant capability in finance at a very young age, and as a result, like saved money and figured out how to do financial aid and all that sort of stuff to fund school and all those things. Whereas I think a lot of folks who probably qualify for a lot of financial assistance or could be saving better, consuming more healthcare products, saving more for their retirement, didn't do so, frankly, because they didn't understand it or thought someone was going to take advantage of them. And I think that was the beginning, right? Like, we talk about how that thread of financial services like plays through my career. Like that was the start of it. It was seeing how like these were people I could walk by on the street in New York City when I was wearing a suit, who had a radically different life than me, and they were not working any less hard. They were not like any less smart. They just didn't have the background to understand this product, and financial institutions weren't designed to like bring those people along. We've come a long way from 20, 30 years ago, but there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah, totally agree. And I know that's, like one of the things that gets you out of bed every morning on the hard days is your commitment to doing that with the portfolio companies you work with and now Deciens. So maybe one more point or one more question as it pertains to your time in the service. So one of the threads I know that we're pulling again, right, is this idea of, building teams, bringing people together, creating culture. When 9/11 happened, you were already enlisted and working. And I know everyone, like record enrollment happened like the next month right after, as all of us that remember it so vividly probably remember well. You were asked to take a role that was different than what you were probably expecting when 9/11 happened, because that skill was already something that they had seen in you. And so I think that's sort of a fascinating nugget for me. Do you mind speaking about that to the audience too?
Yeah. So the quick backstory here is that I came back from basic training August 2001, and I had my first drill weekend, and then September 11th was the Monday after that, and so the world changed pretty soon after. What's interesting is in that August drill, that's the reserve, what we call the reserve weekend, the 2 days, the 1 weekend a month. That a reservist shows up. During that period, which was my first day or my first time reporting to my unit, I was given an onboarding checklist. It was 3 sheets of paper with, probably 20 or 30 people I needed to meet and a bunch of briefings I needed to have. There were 3 or 4 of us who started at the same time, and we got this list from our first sergeant, who's usually in charge of this type of work, and we went off to go fill out the forms. And, by Sunday evening, at the end of the drill weekend, we came back to the first sergeant with our filled out forms and said, okay, we're all set. And the first sergeant was like, what do you mean? Like, yeah, we're done with the onboarding. Like, you're our last briefing. He's like, wait a minute. Like, this usually takes people 3 weekends or 3 drill weekends. So 3 months. Before they're done with it. We weren't expecting to assign you to a duty station for another quarter. And the 3 of us like looked at each other like, are you kidding me? Like, we just had to go do this, right? And so we took care of that. And so, the next weekend we weren't expected in any duty station. So what we ended up doing was training the incoming folks. So there was another batch of folks that would start the next weekend and the weekend after. And so for the couple of weekends we had not been planned, we basically ran a training. We were like buddies to the incoming class. And we did that for a few drill weekends, and then eventually got assigned to duty stations. But then we kind of kept still doing that on the side as a buddy program. And so we helped the next class of folks on board. And so you're right, there was record enrollment in the military, but it takes some time. Everyone signs up, they get assigned, they go to basic training, they go to tech school, they come back. So it's almost 6 months before that batch of people actually shows back up at the individual units in location. And over that period of time, our unit got called up to basically deploy out into the theater. And I was asked to stay behind. And I was pretty upset about it at first. And at the same time, I was like, oh, well, like, I guess I could do this. I could stay here. And the reason I got over it was because the commander had asked me for a very specific reason. And he said, I want you to stay because you've been the most effective person we've ever had at bringing new people up to speed and training the batch of folks. And we're about to get that wall of recruits that signed up immediately post 9/11. And we can't send everyone out. We need to keep, roughly 5 people. I've sort of negotiated to keep 5 people here. So as the incoming folks come on, we've got a crew here that can get them up to speed so that they can be deployable. And, everyone has told me, I think, including you, Brian, that you probably had more impact staying back and helping train the next 60 people who came on board than you probably would have individually, like out in the field, lugging chains and strapping down vehicles. But, certainly at the time, it was a very emotional kind of ask to make, where I knew my unit, all of my teammates were all headed out together and I was going to stay behind. So early story of kind of picking up the torch and training folks, but also kind of a bittersweet moment for me, kind of personally.
Bittersweet, I'm sure, and such a wide range of emotions, but like already folks are seeing you excel in this team building, onboarding, bringing people together, rallying them around the mission, and then executing. And so if we fast forward a little bit, I know you spent some time in finance. To me, again, one of the cool moments in your life is the decision to leave to go to the West Coast. So you want to maybe fast forward a little bit and get us there. Any lessons along the way in finance you want to hit, please do. And then talk about why you wanted to make that pivot.
Yeah, I think probably the most valuable components of my finance career were 2 things. One was understanding how financial services worked, how banks worked, how insurance companies work, how these institutions that sort of hold up our economy and support our economy operated. The second was the ability to actually do the financial analysis itself, to break apart a company, think about how all the pieces fit together, understanding all the accounting, understanding all of the kind of operating metrics, and being conversant and being able to build my own models and do the quick math to break something down. And so that set of skills, I will never look back on as wasted time or anything. That was core to my ability to solve problems. Even today, somebody will start talking to me for more than 5 minutes about something, and I've pulled up Excel or Google Sheets, and I'm kind of building a quick model to help me understand and understand the world. But there came a time where I got, I made my way through a handful of different roles, and as an undergrad, 3 or 4 years in, was on an equity research team at Bear Stearns, kind of I think I alluded to a nice office overlooking Central Park. And thought to myself that, I'm in the job that most people want, and I don't find it interesting. Now, some of that may have been because on my weekends I was down at the base, doing the things that we were doing there, which had real life impact, and I kind of felt disjointed. And this again, back to the white collar versus kind of blue collar world that I was kind of switching back and forth between. I sort of knew I didn't want to go, change my career. I wanted to continue working in a role that, was mentally challenging more than it was physically challenging. but I hadn't quite figured out exactly how to solve that problem yet. At the same time, I had met my wife, or the woman who would become my wife, and she was from Honolulu, and she was incompatible with winter. I'll leave it at that. The winters in New York were not kind to her, and she was ready to go. And so the question was I going to stay in New York in finance, working in a role where I feel like I had made, reasonably faster progress than usual and still feeling unfulfilled, or was I going to go to California and figure something else out? And so, I opted to move to California to figure something else out. Part of the reason I ended up and got into finance in the first place was I kind of looked around in New York and it's like, okay, well, what do the smart people in New York do? Like, who are the elite minds in this area? They all work in finance, so let's go work there and learn from them. And when I got to California, the thought was, well, what do this great minds of California do, or in the Bay Area at least? What are they up to? And that pointed toward the technology industry. And I was a finance guy. So working in tech meant I was going to be in an FP&A function or something like that, but that wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in the business, in the sort of customer facing components, because I, had found that I really enjoyed that work in my finance roles. And so I had kind of figured out my own kind of multi-year plan of moving out to California, build a new network, transition into technology. There's a bunch of different bets I had made on myself, being able to figure stuff out. I took on a new role in a finance company that had an office in San Francisco, joined with them, spent some time in New York working for that office, and then transitioned to the San Francisco team. Applied to the part-time program at Berkeley, in the MBA program there, so that I could do that. Didn't have a ton of savings and cash laying around to be able to take a couple years off. Part of one of the things we had talked about before, my parents took out a bunch of debt to help me go to NYU, and I paid them back for it before I left. I helped them pay off their house, and then moved out to California. So I didn't have a ton of cash in my pockets. So I did a part-time program at Berkeley, built a new network, and then started interviewing with companies. And that's how I found Medallia, and that's the beginning of, probably part 3 of this journey that we're on.
One of the other folks we interviewed, Brandon, talked about like his intentionality and decision making. We chatted with someone else, Elena, who you also know, who I was nowhere near that intentional, more like bloom where you're planted. And I think you have a little bit of both in your story. But this was one of those moments where you were very intentional and said, okay, I want to go west to be with this woman I love, who now is your wife. And then also like, I want to get into tech. And so, but man, I know was a big pivot, because you went from being relatively senior and well-established in finance. And then as you did join Medallia, that was an IC role initially, and you grew that relatively quickly. In fact, pretty quickly, to having one of the biggest and most impactful teams in the company on the CS side. But maybe talk about that moment. Like, had to be a little scary, right? Like going from well established to kind of starting over.
Yeah. I mean, I was an SVP at a big financial institution, and doing well, getting paid good money, and when I decided to move out to California, it was, I remember talking to my wife, Gina, about this. It was like, this is a 5-year plan, right? We're going to move out there, and I'm going to do this job for a year, and I'm going to apply to Cal, and I'll get in in September, and that's 9 months later, and all this sequenced out, and I do that program, and that was a 3-year program. And when I was done with that program, I'd apply to roles, and then in year 5, I'm going to work at a tech company. And God bless her, she was like, cool, if that makes you happy, you should do that. Like, I'm for it. Like, I just can't be in winter anymore. I was like, okay, let's figure it out. And so that was the plan, and we executed on it. And I think that so the broad strokes of the outcomes I wanted were very intentional. how I got there was not. I mean, I even, I don't think I've shared this with a ton of people, but I got waitlisted at Cal, right? Like, so I had this whole master plan, right? Like, got here, showed up, and I was an East Coast person, so I just assumed stupidly that, like, oh, this is a state school, this shouldn't be that hard to get into, like, not knowing anything about like how difficult and elite the UC system is. And so I show up in California being like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna like go to the business school, and people would be like, wait, did you get in already? It's like, no, I'm just gonna apply, and like, it'll be fine. And rude awakening, get smacked across the face with a waitlist note. And like, you gotta roll with the punches, right? Like, I started signing up for sessions that you could go to for free as like a prospective student, showing up on campus, like learning more about the institution so I could like write a letter. And like, I don't know if any of that stuff in the end turned into what ultimately made the decision for them to take me off the wait list. But I certainly wasn't going to quietly sit and wait and see what happened. I was going to, learn as much as I could so that if there was anything I could do, I was going to be prepared for it. And it was a ton of activity. It was a ton of work to get in. And then while I was in it, it was a beast. It was working a full-time job and then taking the train over to Berkeley and spending time in class until, I'd get home at 10 p.m., leave at like 7 a.m. every morning to start the day. And that was 3 years. But it was great.
Yeah, but that work ethic, man. And I know what's the Mike Tyson quote? Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Yeah. And so you said slaps across the face, but that's where my brain went. But you didn't let it knock you down. You continued to put forth the discretionary effort. You continued to like push for what you wanted. And who knows, right? It's similar and especially in enterprise selling. You never know the thing you did that maybe helped get you over the hump and get the win or whatever. But it's all the 100 little things that you think to do and do, even when you're tired, even when it's 10 o'clock at night, that end up like the culmination of that snowball that accumulates over years and years and years. That's the body of work. All right. So you get into Berkeley, you do the thing, you grit your teeth for a couple years, you get your interview with Medallia. They give you an offer. You're like, okay, I'm going to take this pay cut. I'm going to do this thing. You think about those years there. To me, it was watching you build an incredible team. And then that business that you managed was a huge chunk of our revenue, at and around the IPO. And so maybe when you think about those couple of years, maybe what is it, 4 or 5 years there? What are some of the moments or that stick out or lessons that you kind of brought with you when you went over to Segment?
Yeah. So again, it was 5 years at Medallia. I when I joined, I remember really distinctly having this incredible interview day at Medallia, and then kind of walking out of that whole process thinking, man, I don't know if I got this job. Probably the hardest interview set I'd ever done. I don't know if I got this job, but if I did, I definitely want it. But if I didn't, I'm also totally okay with that. And a big part of that was really the interview process you went through, like, didn't allow you to hide who you were and what you wanted and what you were trying to do. And so it was sort of, you kind of accepted that, like, whether this was a fit or not, like, you were going to know. And if it was a fit, it was going to be awesome. And if you weren't a fit, it was not going to be awesome if you got in. And so that was a really novel way of thinking about interviewing, which was really different than the way I had always done interviewing, which was show up to the interview in your nicest suit and tell this person everything they want to hear, and get that job. The problem with that process is you have to be that person every day you show up to work. And if that person's not you, it's hard. And I think that's what I ultimately learned, was what I had done when I had gotten these roles in finance in New York, was I was pretending to be this person that the finance world wanted. And I wasn't actually that person. So it took a lot of my own energy just to behave the way I thought the institution wanted me to. And at Medallia, it was liberating. And I think that, it's great. And it's a huge compliment coming from you and the rest of the team, that I had a big hand in what Medallia built. But, it was an incredible organization that was built from these ideals, which was hire people who are going to love doing this work. Find the people who will do well here because that's who they are, not because they've got to go through Herculean efforts to change their behaviors in order to fit in. And I think that was one of the biggest lessons I learned about interviewing was, these interviews should be bi-directional. You should understand as the interviewee, right, that you are trying to figure out whether or not you will thrive in this organization. And so I think that was probably the biggest thing I picked up was this interview process. And then from there, if you fast forward that to like people development, team development, organizational development, which was like, you want to build these cultures and these practices and these businesses in such a way that they're constantly doing exactly this thing, which is making very obvious to the world around them who they are, what they're going to do, what they want out of you as a teammate or customer or company or whatever it is. Like, don't hide from it. Scream it from the rooftops and teach people how to self-select in or out. And if you do that, then everybody thrives because no one's pretending, right? Everybody's doing the thing that they naturally would love doing. And if you find a bunch of people who naturally love doing the thing they're going to do, they will put in the extraordinary hours. They will put in the extraordinary mental cycles, right? And a lot of times it wasn't that people worked long hours. We did, but it was that you got 100% of someone's creativity when they were doing something they loved. And that was the real unlock. They actually cared about whether or not they were good at what they were doing, or if they solved the problem they set their mind towards solving. And I think that's the key to building great teams.
Making sure that none of that discretionary effort is leaking out into like pretending, but that they're just aligned with the culture, the vision, and the purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's well said, man.
I think that like the type of people we tend to surround ourselves with in high performing companies are people who have grown up in sort of, I'm going to use a weird phrase, but like institutionalized schooling, which is like, here is the test, answer these questions. There are right and wrong answers, right? And in that world, you learn how to take these tests well, right? And so you learn what the teachers want. And so you do those things. And if you just, and we had a bunch of high achieving folks come up to Medallia, try an interview and get in, and they would pretend to be the people we wanted because that's what they had trained themselves to do. They were high achieving people from great institutions and great universities. And our interview process was designed to get underneath that thing and figure out whether those folks actually wanted to do the work that we had for them. And if they did, great, they were going to thrive. And if they didn't, they weren't going to thrive.
So Vishal, you've built CS functions first as an IC and then as a team lead, and then running teams of teams at multiple companies. Like, what does that toolkit look like? What's the playbook? When what advice would you give other folks who are out there either building or growing their CS functions right now?
I think one of the things that set our team apart at Medallia, I sort of started out as the financial services lead. It was just me. No one else wanted to work with financial services. Everybody else was excited to work on some of the incredible retail and hospitality brands that we had. And so I kind of raised my hand for the insurance companies that were not the sexiest, or the credit card companies and things like that. And over time, we built that business into, and I think you've described it. I think I did the math when I was on my way out after 5 years. We were a third of the revenue of the company, and about 40 people. And in the professional services org, in the customer success, what we would call today customer success organization. And that was incredible leverage, right? There were 400 people in the professional services organization globally. And so, the reason we were so successful is we spent so much of our time not being the professional services organization. We spent our time trying to understand, how do we change the product? How do we change the sales organization? How do we change all of the other teams, marketing, analytics, all of these other organizations, so that we acquire customers that will love the product we give them, right? I think it's a misguided view that like customer success or professional services or post-sales or whatever you call that organization is the team responsible for whether or not the customers are happy, right? It's just not, it's a fallacy, right? And the most powerful customer success organizations spend their time certainly serving customers and making sure their needs are met. But the way that they meet those needs is by changing the organization around them so that the organization best meets their needs. And so I spent a bunch of time with product, helping design and build new product capabilities that allowed our systems in the financial services world to better fit the needs of financial services customers. Brian, you and I spent a ton of time on the road selling customers on the right types of programs, right? Not the things that they came to us and said, like, hey, here's the RFP, build me X. We'd go out and talk to them and say, like, well, I know you asked us to build X, but like, we understand your goals to be these other things. So like, how about we do it this way? Here's like 5 other companies like you that did it this way. Why don't we do that instead? Because we know this will work. And those companies changed their minds and had a better experience with the product as a result. And so the most powerful thing I think that I took over to Segment, besides the culture, was this idea and ethos that customer success or post-sales was not a siloed function. It was actually a change agent for the entire organization. And so when we went to Segment, that was the charge of that organization. It was to be the massive sensory organ that learned from customers what they needed, that then embedded themselves, whether it was through hiring, promoting, and moving, transferring people from the post-sales organization into product and sales and solution engineering and consulting and product marketing, all these other functions, or if it was just through kind of a company version of lobbying with these other executives about like, hey, here's the data we have from the customers we currently work with. Here's what I think we should be doing. I had an unfair advantage when I asked for stuff because I had data about everything, right? I had active customers and their behavior that I could access at will. And so I could go to product and say, hey, look, like, here's what's happening. Build this and they will consume it, right? And that was the superpower and is the superpower of every customer facing org. Sales can't do that, product can't do that. They've got to go find ways of collecting information. I have it flowing through my fingertips every day. And so that was how we made world-class customer success organizations.
Let's talk about that a little more. This idea of like the customer success team, to your point, like living and breathing with customers, and how you take all of that goodness, all of that information, all that data, and make sure that it free flows through you and through your team back into the org, notably product, but to your point, everywhere. How do you do that? Like, how do you get in the case of Segment, was that culture sort of already there, or was there work to do to kind of establish, that API, for lack of a better term, internally when you got there?
I think at Segment we had an incredible sort of tailwind in that the founding team was extraordinarily supportive of customer success and doing right by customers from the get-go. And so I had a powerful and important voice in our organization. I think it also helped that we had built our organization to be very technically competent. We sold products to engineers. Our support organization knew how to code. Our implementation folks were by and large engineers by training. And so we had a lot of visibility and honestly, like, technical respect inside a very engineering heavy organization. And so that gave us a lot of ability to influence these other teams. But I think in the end, what it really turned into was repeatedly being able to deliver for those orgs, right? And so we were service providers in many ways, right, to our internal constituents. So I'll give 2 examples. And I think one we did at Medallia also, and the other I think was specific to Segment. But the one is with our support engineering org. We had an incredible support engineering org that took a long time to build up to its capability and its sort of proper scale. But that team had so much respect by the engineering and product organizations that when they came, they always came with data. They always came having sort of tried 10 ways to Sunday to try and solve the problem another way. And when they came with like all of that stuff together in a package to talk to the product manager or the engineer and say, hey, we have a problem. This customer can't solve this issue. Here's all the things we have tried. Here is what we believe the expected behavior is. And here's why it's not doing that. And like, by the way, in some cases, we looked at the code and like, I think the problem's somewhere in here, right? And like, that's not a normal support organization. That was an incredible support organization. And I give all the kudos in the world to the folks that built that team and the culture of that organization to be that thorough, because it meant that when I asked engineering or product to do something, they knew it wasn't a shoot from the hip. I had one meeting, I had one conversation, and now I changed my mind. It was a well-researched, well thought through, investigated request. I think the other path where we've really done a great job of helping sales is, we all have this case where we sell customers who either knowingly or unknowingly were not a great fit for our product. And that's either because we were trying lots of different products, we were trying lots of different messaging, we were trying to see if different, customers would bite. In some cases, we just had very creative salespeople. But then those products would come over to the post-sales organization, we would have to service them, and we'd have to figure out how to get them happy or not in some cases, right? And so what we would do as a matter of course was make sure that we spent a lot of time and energy talking about, explaining, writing up all of the really successful customers. Because the easiest way to get more successful customers, right, is to hit sales to sell customers who are very likely to be successful. And the easiest way to get sales to sell the customers you want is to give them a ton of material that they can use to go sell. They'll go after the happy path, right? If there's no content saying, go sell this customer that has this very weird, peculiar use case, they're not going to go sell that unless they absolutely have to. If they got a ton of content that supports these use cases, you can knock down every day, they're going to sell more of those. And so we spent a lot of our time just taking the successes that we saw and feeding them to marketing and to sales so that we just got more of those leads, which meant that we had more of those customers over time. And it just compounded.
Yeah, I love that. That's a flywheel, right? If you get that going, your best customers are your customers, and then you've got to teach everyone to know what that looks like. So they target it and know it when they see it, and then give you more of them. It's either a vicious or virtuous cycle. It's going to be one of the two in your org once you have some scale. If you're not doing what you just described intentionally, like I don't know, Michael Jordan quote, right? If you're not getting better, somebody else is, and by definition, you're getting worse. And so I think that's super, super important. Figuring out how to close that loop back from sales maybe does a great job selling a customer on the vision. If the vision changes or if the product changes or whatever, you've got to make sure that loop goes back to sales, the things that you're seeing in CS that are working and not working. That's made it very evident to the folks that are on the front lines very, very early. Yeah. What else, man? Like I know thinking about the teams there and the when do you hire? When do you not? When do you promote from within? When do you go out? Because you grew a ton in those 4 years, and so thinking about that thread of creating that team and kind of that network internally. What else did you pick up as you grew the actual size and the humans within the org?
Yeah, I think probably one of the things that's most in conflict with my peers in VC, I would say, is I have never regretted having a junior person step up. Lots of VCs will often say, hey, we need to get adult supervision. Go get someone who's done this 5 times before. Let me introduce you to some executive who's already been there, done that. And I have found in my career as an operator, finding your high performing teammate and giving them a shot, giving them 10% of your energy and time and devotion to getting good at the next level role was always returned 100 times over. And, I look back at my career and the things that I'm most proud of. And it's that, if I think of my direct reports, both at Medallia, when I had, 5 or 6 direct reporting folks inside the customer success org, and I guess at 1.8 of them, and then at Segment, and at SnapDocs, the same thing. Almost every one of those people, given 2 years, is a VP of CS somewhere else, or a VP of product. Every one of them. That's awesome. Some of these people are 30 years old, right? That's That's legit. Like
Yeah.
those people, investing in those folks, like I got a VP level operator, right, to run a small piece of our business. That person had that capability at that moment, right? They had that potential. I gave them a little bit of string, I gave them a little bit of coaching and guidance, and they blossomed and took it over. And it's a huge part of why I had so much leverage. I had all this time to go think about the product things, to go work with a sales organization, to go push the flywheel effect, because I knew the house was taken care of, right? And that was, that was probably the biggest part of it. And honestly, it was the reason I could recruit, retain, and keep happy the folks on my team, was because they knew that I was going to invest in them. All I asked back was that they invest back in the business. And it was great for their careers, and it was great for our organizations.
I want to go back to that quote. You said something like, I've never regretted investing in someone junior. I think directionally, I totally agree. I'd have to think about it to know if I actually agree 100% or not. I haven't done the inventory, but it says something about you too, that you know how to pick the right people to invest in. And so I just want to like pick your brain a little bit on that. Like you've batted 1,000 with these folks that you've invested in. The reason that adage probably exists in VC and elsewhere is because not everyone bats 1,000, right? You when we try this, some percentage of the time it doesn't work. And so I'm curious, as you think through, what did those folks all have in common, or what did you see in them that let you feel? And maybe the first time you didn't have as much confidence, but I'm sure it grew in time. Like, hey, I know person X has it, whatever it is, and I'm gonna invest in them. I'm gonna give them this runway because I'm confident in their ability. Like, how do you pick those winners?
I think it's the same as when I think about the founders that I often, like, probably the biggest investing decision I make at Deciens is confirming whether or not we will put more money to work, right? Because I typically get involved after we have written an initial check. It's when the company needs more money, and I'm a loud voice in that conversation. And the founders I will pound the table on are the ones who have this voracious appetite for learning. These folks who want to get better every day, who do not believe, despite all of the incredible credentials they already have, that they are the smartest person in the room, that they can learn from everybody else around them. And those people, and like, maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because, that person is like directionally, like, I want to teach that person. And so if that person thinks they can learn from me, they will learn and they will get better. And so it's a mutual thing, right? Like, maybe I bat 1,000 with this type of person, because that's the trade I'm making with them, right? I'll invest in you if you're willing to learn from me, right? And therefore, if you're willing to learn, this works. But I think that's more broadly true, right? Like, this was one of our core cultural values at Medallia, and it has been at many other companies. Lots of people talk about growth mindset and all that stuff. But I think that more at Medallia than any other company, that was core to the ethos of everyone there. It was like we were all highly competent at our jobs, and we all believed we could get better every day. And I think as long as you have that, as long as you haven't gotten to the point where you're like, man, I already know how to do this. Like, as soon as you think you already know how to do it, like, investing in you isn't going to change you. You're not going to get better.
Yeah, your ears turn off. Yeah, that's right.
I just think about that with founders who are sort of, in some ways, in this dual position, right? They're CEOs typically, so they're the most senior person in their company, and everybody looks to them to be the person with the answers. So you get this mental model of like, I'm the person with the answers. At the same time, as a founder, they know they are challenging an entire industry as not the incumbent, right? And so they've got to be able to hold both of those universes in their heads at the same time. And I think that's also true of executives, right? Like, even in the roles I was in when I wasn't CEO, or if I've been, a VP or just a team manager, to your team, you've got to be a source of solving a problem. Sometimes it's giving the answer, or working with someone to figure out the answer, or being the expert. But at the same time, you've got to walk out of that room, go to another room, and be like, okay, well, now I need to learn way more about some other thing that I need to get better on. And as long as you can hold both of those in your head at the same time, I think that's really the secret, is being able to know when you've got to like make a call and like you can't collect more information, but at the same time knowing that like there's always more information to learn, like making the decision on when it's right to pick one or the other.
Strong beliefs loosely held, right?
Yeah,
I can't remember if that's you or someone else that I heard that from the first time. I'm sure it's a phrase that somebody's coined, but so apologies if anyone's copyrighted that. But I think that's what I'm hearing you say, and I agree, is this idea: to be a great leader, you've got to be able to make decisions. You got to be right a little more than you're wrong. But then you've got to be able to also have the like mental agility to take in new information, take in new ideas, and sometimes even delegate, and also know when to do those things. And so again, knowing you like I do, and knowing just the quality human you are, this like the capstone in your career, the thing you're most proud of, yes, the IPO, yes, a great acquisition and event, but man, the humans that you've helped achieve their full potential, or maybe even more than they would have thought what they were capable of in the short amount of time. That is the thing that you value, I know. And it's just been like a ton of fun to hear you talk about it now, and some of the things you've picked up that you've helped others with. And man, I hope and think it will translate beautifully to Deciens too, where now you're doing that same thing with just a different set of folks, right? These are founders, early stage companies that you're investing your time and energy in now in a slightly different way. But so we've kind of come full circle. We started with Deciens. How did you make that pivot? Like, how and why did you decide to kind of get into this world in the first place?
Yeah, in some ways, I've been moonlighting in this world for a little bit, even while I was in a lot of these other organizations. I met Dan Kimmerling, who's the founder and managing partner at Deciens, through a social connection, or as a social connection through a coworker at Medallia, and we kind of hit it off as friends. We both share a love for food and coffee, and the fact that financial services is woefully inadequate for most humans. Those three go together, pretty easily. So we're a little bit weird, but also share some fun commonality. I actually happen to come from grow up in the same town in Edison, New Jersey, and we didn't meet until San Francisco many years later. And I think we both grew up with the same kind of upbringing where we saw this disparity in the world and understood, sort of New York finance and banking not to be the end all be all. But I met him, and we started doing dinner parties together often, where he'd invite me over, or we'd go out to dinner, we'd go to a fundraiser or something like that. And I met some of the portfolio founders through that, and just striking up dinner conversation, not knowing who these folks were, just jumped into like advice and solution giving mode, and like, oh, you're trying to do that, like, here's how I did it here. And I remember after I think it was the Thanksgiving dinner, where I spent some time with one of the founders, the founding teams in our portfolio. Dan called me the next day. He was like, hey, thanks so much for coming over. I've still got your plate from that porchetta you brought over. And but like, hey, can those guys call you again? Because they told me they like really enjoyed the conversation and found it really helpful. I was like, yeah, sure, I'm happy to do it. And that happened over and over again, where I find myself talking to founders, and then eventually Dan was like, hey, like, we've got this portfolio company who needs some help with the go-to-market and the customer success and onboarding. Like, do you think you could talk to them for a bit? Spent an hour or two with them, did a couple of phone calls, and got into a cycle where I turned into an advisor for that organization, and so that kept happening with Dan and other organizations and other VCs that I had come to know. Oftentimes it was like recruiters would call me up, or VC recruiters would come find me and then ask me to talk to their portfolio companies. And so I just kind of did this stuff on the side. And as I was wrapping up my time at SnapDocs, I wasn't quite ready to jump back into it. This was still in the height of COVID, and the world was kind of in a weird place. I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do next. And I started doing this a little bit more. I sort of signed up with Deciens part-time, partially to like try it out and see if this was a thing I could do as a job, if I felt fulfilling and satisfying, because it wasn't, I had a very specific operating cadence, right? Like, I'd get to my office, I'd opened up my computer and I was on Zoom from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., just like cranking through conversations and customer meetings and team meetings and all that sort of stuff. And this was a very different work style. And I wanted to make sure that it would be fulfilling for me. So going back to, I wanted this interview to be mutual fit. I wanted to be able to enjoy being that. And I wanted them to make sure they enjoyed the work I was doing and found value in it. And so we did that for almost 6 months. And that's how we got hooked up. At the end of kind of 3 or 4 months, Dan and I started a conversation. I'm like, okay, well, how does this feel for you? Like, how does it feel for you? And, gladly, we both were having a good time doing it and got a lot of value out of it. And so I am where I am now.
Well, you seem happy, you seem fulfilled. And it, like we said, sort of in the beginning, like it seems very logical. It seems like a kind of a natural endpoint, maybe not endpoint, but at least next point on your journey when I look at it as an outsider, right? I think it's a great use of all of your skills and experiences. And I know it allows you to be a little bit more present with your family, and that's a big piece of who and what you are too. So I'm pumped you found it, man. And I really thank you for joining us as we think about wrapping up here. We do this with all of our guests, Vishal, but we will make a donation to a charity of your choosing in your name. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about what you picked and why?
Yeah, I chose the animal shelter in Sebastopol, California, which is where I live. I found a love for dogs living out here in California. I think there's just that undying love, the unjudging love that comes from your dog when you come home, whether it's from your office out in the backyard or when commuting down to Palo Alto. It's an unmistakable feeling, the unconditional love, and I just hope that more and more people can experience it. I think there are lots of pets that found their way into homes that maybe didn't have the time or space or energy to care for them long term, and I am worried for a lot of those incredible creatures who all they have is love to give for people, are sitting in shelters because people hadn't quite thought through either the economics or the time commitments or the convenience to their life. I think it's just a shame. And so I hope they all find great homes. We've got our own dog, and I'm trying to convince my wife that we should have more. Until then, hopefully the donation will take care of a future pet for somebody else.
Love it, man. Yeah, near like a super warm spot for me too. We've got our own dogs. I'm actually fostering 2 for one of my buddies who's deployed right now. So there's 5 dogs in our house. There's like German Shepherd tumbleweeds rolling through my office, and my colleague Jamaica, who I'm sure a lot of folks listening know as well, just had her interview today for their second dog. So love it, man. We'll make the donation in your name. And Vishal, thank you so much for coming on, for being yourself, for sharing a lot of personal moments and some great professional stories too. Thanks again for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Great to be here.